Um, we haven't done a Zoom book club in a while, so we're excited about this. Thank you all for joining us. Just to open up the conversation with a bit of a softball, I was curious just what, people's favorite scenes were from the movies, or from the book. And or perhaps scenes that just stuck with you afterwards. I think there were a lot of emotional scenes, either in the ways that they made you laugh or maybe cry. I'm curious what, people were taking away from it.
I think the most exciting thing that I loved the book, but the part where the lady across the street that took care of the little girl was going to get married to, I haven't read the book in a while, so I forget the name of the guy that became almost a father figure to the little girl, and how they formed their relationship. Do you know who I mean?
Yeah, you're thinking of the producer, Walter?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
And the name of the lady that was the neighbor that watched
Harriet.
Harriet, yes.
Yes. I don't know about anyone else, but when Walter was first introduced in the beginning, I was wondering if this was going to be Elizabeth's second love.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated the fact that Harriet was able to find her second love after being unhappy in her marriage, versus Elizabeth, never planned to get married and found a true love and had a kid. But in this story, I think personally her love story had to do a bit more with her career and her daughter.
I thought it was really unusual to have a book about a woman like that, where the main story, where there wasn't a big kind of crescendo to a finale where, oh, she found her mate. I thought it was a very feminist, nice, refreshing perspective that was not the main or whatever point of the book. And I mean, there was a lot of beautiful romance in the book, but I appreciated that was very different.
What did other people think of the ending? Elizabeth is no longer doing supper at 6. She doesn't have any new partner in her life, but she does have a position at her lab finally. Are people satisfied with the ending? Are they sad at all? Did they wish anything for her?
I'm looking forward to something that will follow up after this, a sequel. Right.
Mm.
I know that there is talk of a TV show as well. And
Yes.
so that's something we might be able to see at the end of this year.
What have you heard about that? About a possible TV show? Is it actually maybe going to happen?
Yeah, Apple TV is supposed to be producing it. I don't have all of the details, but I think they actually have like a photo on set already.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think they've already started casting. Brie Larson is supposed to be in the movie, according to this thing I quickly just pulled up on Google. And so we'll just have to stay tuned. But I know for one, I really enjoyed seeing Elizabeth in her cooking show. And I almost wish that the show existed to watch myself. So I'll be curious to see how they produce it for television. But I was just kind of curious, what did people think of the show? Elizabeth was kind of butting heads with the producer and what the show was really going to be about, from what the set was going to look like, what she was going to look like on camera, and then how she was actually going to present the information. And of course, she is a chemist, so she presented everything in chemical terms, but she took on much broader subjects along the way. So what were maybe a few of your favorite episodes of hers, or what do you think she really set out to accomplish versus what the production studio had hoped for her to accomplish?
Well, one of my favorite things that happened as a result of that cooking show was that she happened to have a knife in her purse to prevent any more upsetment to her physical life and mental, emotional life, that she was able to take things into her own hands. And I love the way they presented it as her having that person having a heart attack or whatever. That was just very, very well done.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other thoughts to share on that scene, or?
Oh, I was the only one that really liked that scene.
I can see how it brings up a lot of emotions or thoughts.
Yes. Finally, she was able to assert herself.
Yeah.
Not that she never had trouble asserting herself. She never had trouble, but she had to actually take things into her own hands for self-preservation.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the first time she had attacked someone assaulting her.
That pill, the yellow pencil, right?
Yes. And so here she was yet again, decades later. She is a daughter now, and here she is still being brought into an office by someone with a higher position than her and being put into this situation. And like you were saying, Hannah, she could finally protect herself this time before anything really happened and before another, negative chapter was added to her story. I think there was a theme of, assault on women and just the degradation she experienced in her work throughout the novel. And really in the end, we saw that sort of takeover of women in the lab where, sorry, I'm trying to find what her name was, Frask, the assistant, who at first really tore down Elizabeth in the office, was kind of jealous of her, would spread rumors. And then by the end of the novel, we saw Frask, in a chief position. We saw Elizabeth stepping into one. And of course, we saw Calvin's mother, who was, allowing this change to happen as someone who provided a lot of money for the lab. I was wondering if people were able to forgive Frask for the role she played in Elizabeth's downfall in the lab. She did help spread the rumors about her pregnancy. And then as the story continues, you found out that Frask had been assaulted, which got in the way of her education, very similar to how Elizabeth had to switch her plans for her education. And then the two of them, end up in the lab together working again as colleagues. Do you think that you're able to forgive Frask through the storyline and hearing about her history and hearing how she really stood up for Elizabeth? Or do you think that maybe that was unearned a little bit by the ending?
I think that's an interesting question, which I certainly didn't think about as I was reading. But now that I reflect on it, I don't think I ever really warmed up to Frask again. I was still dubious of her.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one passage in the book that really evoked emotions from me, and that is when she went back to the boss, and I don't remember his name, and wanted to reapply to work there. And he was so condescending to her and wouldn't even consider her as a chemist, was going to give her a clerical job. I wanted to jump through the book and slap him.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I think it's just so, on the one level, this book was just really great and entertaining, but it is so profoundly sad to think about, all the stuff that this is really in reality based on that's happened to women, and to many other minority groups or whatever, or, mistreated groups. I mean, and so it's just, that there were obviously, like when you're asking about Frask, there were lots of, I'm sure, women who were not enlightened yet in a certain way, who would have had to be people who would change. And so I kind of forgave Frask, thinking, well, it's inevitable. There would have been people who were one way and then would change. That's kind of part of, for me, that's just part of what is going to happen if things are going to move forward. There are going to be people who were on the other side who are going to come over. And But like I say, I thought it was also so interesting that here we are in 2023, that this book, I was kind of interested to know what other people thought about, why this book kind of came out now, why this author wrote this now. I mean, like looking back, I grew up when feminist ideology was just sort of new and being talked about, in the late 60s and 70s, and it was a topic that was talked about a lot. And I was so interested that this book came out now, and to know, why people think it's reaching such a good big audience now, and how it fits in. Like, is the younger generation, how are they warming up to this book? I don't know. I was just trying to place it, because for me, it's like pulling out a piece of my past. So I just wondered how people feel about it. I mean, it's great. I think it's great that it's coming out now, or anytime. But I just wondered how people felt about that. It's so cool that it's a bestseller now.
It's been about 6 months since I read this book, but so I'm going on memory here. But my recollection suggests that this author has been an editor for years with a publisher. She was editing other people's books and writing this along the way. And so I think she finally decided, I'm going to give it a shot myself. So I think this book was long in its development. And to your point, Amy, the timing of it could have been really great now or really great 10 years ago, because the conditions that exist that at least I hear about, whether it's the legal profession or out in Silicon Valley or in publishing, or in soccer. Hello, what's going on today?
Yeah.
So, I think women have had to deal with, not just women, but other minorities, as someone else pointed out, have had to deal with being under the thumb of others quite a bit, and I sadly, it still resonates.
Yep. Well, I really enjoyed it. The book, I thought it was excellent.
It was an easy read. That's the thing I think I liked about it the most. It was so easy to sail through. And my guess is this woman, this writer, being an editor herself, knew how to make it that way. And my hope is that she doesn't wait another 10 or 20 years to publish another.
Yeah.
Someone was saying they want to know what happens next. It would be great to have either a sequel, or in the TV show, maybe they'd carry it on.
Mm-hmm.
I think the fact that it aroused all your emotions, 1 minute you were crying, the next minute you were laughing, the next minute you were just anticipating what is going to happen next. So all those emotions to me were very, very important in the book.
I just want to circle back briefly to the question of, does anyone else have any thoughts on, the setting of this book? It's a book that was published, here in the 21st century, and we're looking back to the 50s. And in some ways, things feel very relevant, but in others, you're really forced to think about, this is a different time. And it's shocking in some ways reading what Elizabeth was going through, but placing yourself in Elizabeth's shoes, like, she had to let so much brush off her back because of how common it was for her. One of the things that really stood out to me was how she was treated while she was pregnant. The kinds of things people would say to her in the grocery store about how it's only going to get worse from here once she has kids, or people in the elevator that would reach out and touch her body without her giving permission. I think that those scenes really stood out to me. And so these are the sort of feminist touches in the book that, are still very relevant today. And I think in part it's easier to set the book back a few decades and it makes it feel almost more timeless, versus if they tried to set it today and wrangle with all of the issues we're facing today, and then it might feel stale in a couple of years. That's at least my take.
No, I agree.
It doesn't feel so long ago to me. I mean, I can remember being in graduate school and being told my dress was too short, and my mom being told her clothes were inappropriate, or her dress was too short, or whatever it was. And I mean, it's, it doesn't, I think, but so I don't know, but I agree with your point. If it were set right now, I don't think it would have as much resonance as it does, because now we look at this and we can say, a lot of this is still insidiously going on. So
what did people think of, as you're talking about like your mother and generations, what did people think of Mad once Elizabeth's daughter was introduced? And Elizabeth had her own style of parenting that we got to see as well.
Well, I think she gave her daughter a lot of possibilities. She enabled her to do all the things that she was doing herself. In other words, she didn't just treat her like a little kid, she knew how smart she was, and she enabled her to grow even more in her interests in those ways, and make her a part of well, enabled her to be more herself.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the book sort of grapples with this idea of like, what does it mean to be smart? Elizabeth was obviously a very intelligent woman, but men would talk down to her saying that, well, you're just not smart enough to understand. And in most situations, that did not mean book smart. It meant, she's not smart to the way the world works, or she just, because she's a woman, they're just putting her down, trying to say genetically she'll never be as smart as them. And I think it's very interesting. Calvin and Elizabeth were both partly self-taught, where they would go to libraries a lot as a source of knowledge. And Mad continues that as she's going to the library and investigating her own family tree. I think, libraries and learning are very central to this book. And so I was a bit curious, like, what your thoughts are on how Mad really had this freedom to explore different subjects and was encouraged to, unlike her parents, explore that curiosity. And her mother even, forged her birth certificate so she could go into school sooner, which was, her way of trying to support her curiosity and search for more knowledge. So I was curious what people thought of the role of, self-learning, and how maybe because people were encouraged, how the characters then had to take it upon themselves. Do you think libraries still play such an important role in people's learning? Or do you think maybe technology and computers have taken over some of that? I know Mad was going to the librarian and asking for books, as was Calvin when he was a child, although some of the pages might be missing when he was in his orphanage.
she would have been on a smartphone all the time now, probably Googling.
Yeah. YouTube University, I think, would have been probably very big for these characters. And maybe it wouldn't have been a cooking show on TV, but a YouTube channel or something like that if this was set in modern times.
I'm gonna hop in here as a retired librarian. I've worked in public libraries, music libraries, and school libraries, and served in an administrative role. And right now, libraries are being threatened nationwide in a very not subtle way. And I think the role of libraries, as was exhibited in this book, is exactly what continues. And even though kids are Googling and have access to electronic resources, it's still the librarians that teach the digital literacy and how to verify those sources to know whether they are looking at true facts or somebody else's opinion that has gone viral. And it's even more important to have librarians, both public and school, literally be front and central. And for that piece, that's not even to talk about all the book banning and censorship issues that are arising across the state. We're really at a critical, crucial, scary point in American history when you think of those things. And in terms of lessons in chemistry, she obviously had access to experiences and knowledge and facts that she would not have had if she didn't have access to that library. So just kind of my soapbox.
I'm not a librarian, but I want to build on that. I'm reading Dear America.
Oh, yes.
A letter from, let's see, an undocumented
Citizen.
citizen. Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
And he talks about how libraries saved his life, educated him. Of course, he is an award-winning journalist at this point, but he leveraged libraries, which were free to him, and he didn't have to worry about his undocumented status in getting that education. Now, he had a lot of help on the way, and he started out with a lot of IQ. So all of that helps. But thank God for libraries and thank God for education. And they're both under attack.
Right, that is correct. Jose Vargas is coming to Winston-Salem the end of September for the Bookmarks Festival of Authors and Books. And he's giving the closing keynote on Saturday afternoon. So highly recommend that you come and it's a free festival. So his message is quite powerful in a lot of different ways.
Where is that going to be?
Winston-Salem downtown on in front of the Haynes Milton Rhodes Art Center on Holly and I don't know if it's Liberty maybe, right off of 4th Street. And it's on Friday, September 23rd. And lots of great authors, but Jose Vargas is the closing at 5 o'clock on Saturday.
And WFDD will be there as well. And so
Yes.
just stop by and say hello. Switching gears back to the book for a minute. We had mentioned earlier her pencil, which is a reoccurring, I would say, symbol in the book. And so when she's on the show, she always has it behind her ear or in her hair. It's on the cover of the book. And of course, it was also a weapon at one point in time. So I was curious if anyone had, some thoughts on, she even talks about why she uses a pencil rather than a pen. And I think the object sort of stuck out to me. Does anyone had any thoughts about the symbols of the pencil and why that was, picked to be so representative of her and to place so much meaning in for her? I think the cover of the book itself, honestly, can warrant some conversation. I know that, Bonnie Garmis herself said that she hated the American cover for the book. And so if you look at some of the international covers after this or on your own desktops, you'll see it's depicted a little differently. Did people like the American cover that you saw with the red cover with her and her hair in a bun and the glasses, the little pencil in her hair?
I just loved it. I love the picture that they have for our country. And I love seeing that pencil. To me, it made me think I should wear a pencil in my hair all the time for a lot of reasons, but just in support of women.
It does make it look, the book, I mean, I liked it, but I thought it might make the book look less serious than it really is. And it's a wonderful, kind of case for the need to be thinking in feminist ways, I think. And I hoped it didn't make I mean, it all maybe almost made me think it wasn't going to be a serious book, and it was. It was funny, but it was serious. So I'm a little unsure about whether that was the best cover.
I think too, if you look at some of the other covers, there's this one, you'll see two different versions of it where it's sort of her torso like head down, so like from the neck, and she's carrying a briefcase, but instead of it looking like a briefcase, it looks like a TV where it has like her cooking set on it. And in one version of that cover, she's wearing a skirt, and in another, she's wearing pants. And it frames her a little bit more as like a working woman compared to this. When I first picked it up, I had told a friend, like, I think it might be a romance novel. And then going into that, 25% of the way through the book, I was just like blown away when Calvin died. This was not a romance novel. It was so much more than that. And I was like, I had to step away from the book for a minute personally when Calvin passed away. I had wondered in the beginning, where the daughter was going to come in, and I was not quite prepared for that tragedy myself. I was curious, like, how did people receive Calvin? Did you think their relationship was, the perfect chemistry that Elizabeth sort of saw it as? They both had their faults, but they complemented each other in a lot of ways. Did you think that they had a great relationship? He did propose and she rejected him, but they seemed to make it work after that.
Right, but then remember they got 6:30, right? Wasn't it? So that was kind of like an inkling that maybe things would change, if he they I mean that 6:30 entering their life to me was hope that maybe something other, it would progress in that area.
Yeah, they lived together, they got the dog, and who knows what would have happened if she were to have found out she was pregnant while they were together. But also, sorry, but she also never had any intentions for marriage. And then after, it seems like she had explained the two of them almost as, atoms colliding. And I think it was that sort of lightning bolt. She doesn't really seem to be looking for a companion. She's very dedicated to her research, and I think they were just the perfect match for each other, that they were in the same field. And she ended up really falling in love with rowing as well as a result of that relationship, which I think came to be very pivotal in her life. Her love for rowing was able to last, you know, throughout the novel. It started with Calvin, but then after he died, it was not only a way for her to stay connected with him, but to connect with herself, I think, more importantly, as life was overwhelming her, to get out of her house for a bit and, like they were saying, try to take those moments for yourself. I think, rowing kept her sane after she gave birth and she was alone with her child. Does anyone else think, what would she have done without that? And that love of sports, do you think that, what role do you think that plays in a person's life? And, what might have happened to her if she didn't have this community to be able to fall back on?
It showed her powerful strength. She had so much strength and was willing to take on the hardest things. And that was who she was.
And I mean, she also encouraged other women to start rowing, which ended up being a nationwide problem as women were flocking to, begin this new sport. Why do you think that Supper at Six, Elizabeth's voice was as powerful as it was? Why do you think the show succeeded so much?
Well, I think it succeeded because people watch television. And this was a new thing for them to see a woman so dynamic in front of them and teaching them not just cooking, but medical terms and the science of what exactly they were eating for them to know that, impart that information to them. So I think people really wanted to learn as a result of watching her show, and they kind of became very addicted to it. They wanted to see more of it. It was a great show.
It
I
appeared
think,
to,
oh, I'm
it
sorry.
appeared, it appeared to their intellect rather than just the job of cooking. You know, it gave meaning to them. It gave them an empowerment. Showed that they weren't just somebody in the kitchen. They were somebody with a lot of intelligence in the kitchen.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on just what you said, that women of that era were not expected to exercise their intellect. And this was really all of a sudden kind of waking that up. And it had, I think, maybe an effect on me, like it had on the viewers, if that feeling of, you know, of encouragement to be to feel empowered and to stake out your place. And I kept thinking, man, I want to be more like her in terms of she's just fearless, you know, just forges right ahead. And obviously that could create some problems, but I mean, I enjoyed sort of being around her, so to speak, just because just watching how she navigated her way through such adversity with so much courage. And I'm sure those audience members felt some of that. That's what I imagine. I know it's fiction, but
Yeah, on her last episode, she had talked about recommitting to your dreams, and that's what she was doing, leaving the show and going to pursue chemistry again. Did anyone feel like incited to re-pursue any of your dreams, or maybe think about what they were? I feel like this was a little bit of a rallying cry.
Mm-hmm.
I think someone had mentioned it earlier, but this book really evokes a lot of emotions, from, you know, laughter to tears. And I think in a book full of sadness, it was balanced out by a lot of funny moments, despite the character Elizabeth not necessarily being a funny woman. And so I was curious, that balance of, on the show, Elizabeth wanted to be very true to herself, but I think she also started to understand, thanks to the producer, the position that her audience might be in. He had talked when he was bringing her onto the show that, you know, this is like the sort of depression part of your day where things are slowing down, you're like maybe a bit groggy, you're trying to re-energize yourself. And then he was trying to tell her how her job is to entertain. And she herself was going through a really hard time when the show came into her life. So I thought it was very interesting that here she was trying to help other women through, and I think the show helped. She was able to help herself through the show, along with so many women in the book. I'm not sure if I had a question in there. But I'm just curious, I guess, what other people's thoughts were about just sort of that, you know, how you're able to push yourself through your grief, especially as Elizabeth had a daughter. I think a lot of the novel shows her having to challenge her beliefs in different ways, in order to figure out, like, how can I show up for my daughter? How can I show up for myself? And what do other people need from me? So I think her compromising on the show to think about other people was a moment of growth for her a little bit. And so do people feel like, I mean, I think she was very staunch in her beliefs, talking about how she's an atheist on the show and being uncompromising. But does anyone think maybe she spoke too much, or like even when she talked to Time, she ended up delving so much into her background history that the reporter almost didn't know what to do with her by the end of it all. And so she seems to have kind of two modes sometimes, which I think could be argued as a strength and a weakness to her. Do you think it maybe leans one way or another?
I would just like to address the fact that because I enjoyed it so much, and I asked other members of my book club how they liked it, and there were two people that said it certainly wasn't my favorite book, and another one said I really didn't like it, and I was like, oh my gosh, maybe I'm reading it differently, and I don't hear anybody here mentioning anything negative about it until you just put that that up yourself. But did anybody else feel negative about it?
So our book was read it 6 months ago, again, quite a while ago. We all enjoyed it. And I think as much because it was such an easy read as anything else. We kind of vacillate between books that are more challenging and then going for something that's a little bit lighter. So I mean, I think we largely agreed that it was well written, but most of all, we all enjoyed it.
I did wonder if that the thing with when she declared that she was an atheist, I can imagine how it went over in 1960 on TV, but I also wondered how people felt about that today, because it was it sure was a shocking thing to say. And I wondered if that would turn people off today, or if people thought that, well, that's just part of this novel and that shows this character. But I thought that was interesting. I wasn't expecting that.
I mean, religion is explored in multiple places throughout the book, especially as Calvin was raised through that Christian orphanage. And then as Mad talks to I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember the character's name.
Wakely.
Yes, Reverend Wakely. And so the two of them have their own relationship. Did people like this sort of grappling with faith, or maybe did it distract you from other points? Do you think the through lines complemented the storyline, or did it maybe bring up personal emotions for you?
I don't think she was really an atheist. I think she was saying that, but the way she dealt with people and her family, and I just did not see what she was saying she was as actually who she was.
I think Mad had that one line where she talked about faith not being based on religion, but religion being based on faith, when she was talking with Wakely. And I think even you see Elizabeth sometimes grappling with things where she can't fully understand and express her emotions. And she does have this faith that she cannot fully verbalize where it comes from. Do you see faith and we don't need to get too in the weeds here either of things, but do you think faith and religion are tied together? And do you think you saw faith in Elizabeth and in their relationships? I think even we see Reverend Wakely questioning his relationship to God. And so I think in the novel, they're not trying to necessarily make any statements, but just to explore those feelings of doubt that sometimes that come with religion, or just questions, especially with all of the tragic background these characters have. And the role of science in the book. Science and religion are sometimes seen as things that butt heads. But I think it was very interesting how the Reverend had a very personal interest in science and had this pen pal relationship with Calvin, where they were able to have a friendly debate about science and religion and how the two sort of coexist. And they, said in the letters they didn't always agree, but they were able to have this civil discourse together.
Somebody said it was an easy read, and I think it was an easy read, but it brought in a lot of tough things. And so I felt there was a lot of depth in the book that you could really go into, like things you're going into right now. I don't think it was just a book that you could read just once. Maybe you would want to read it again. Maybe I'm thinking now that I've read it a while ago, and you're bringing up different things that I think I might want to read it again and delve a little into different aspects. So to me, that's a good book if you want to read it again.
Yeah. Does anyone else think that if they were to read it again after their first read, they might see it through a fresh set of eyes, might have some new takeaways?
I think that would be a good idea for me, and I certainly will be reading it again because I'll be giving a book program on this book in March. And I do think that it'll, I guess, my first read, and I've only read it once, my first read, of course, was just to get the storyline. And so this conversation today is very helpful because it will make me think about things that I don't think about when I'm just trying to get the storyline.
Yeah.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yes.
I think a lot of those, what feel like big scenes where they're tackling like big ideas, big subjects, are very short. It'll only be a few paragraphs, a few lines, and it can add so much meaning to the book that in some ways it is a rather quick read. Like, I was always curious what's going to happen next, flipping through the pages. But at the same time, there were some passages where I felt like, okay, maybe I do need to sort of step away for a moment and think about this, where it was almost philosophical at times, which I thought was rather interesting.
Absolutely. This discussion has been fantastic. I mean, I really have gotten a lot from it, and I appreciate the fact that the sharing is so wonderful. And I think that that's what's important about book clubs, because you're not an isolate just reading this book by yourself, but you're seeing it in different eyes after a discussion such as this, and it's just empowering.
I'm also enjoying the conversation. Thank you, Hannah. And I do agree that there's a lot to take away from a book through some conversation.
Can anyone help me remember? One thing I kept struggling with was, how old was Mad supposed to be? Because here she was traipsing around town, going to the library on her own and having all this, I wondered, and I know she was like a child genius and she had geniuses for parents, but maybe I missed it, but I know, and she was in was it first grade she was supposed to be in? Anyway, I wasn't sure what people thought about that, how old she was supposed to be, and whether that was realistic to people, because her conversational ability was amazing. Mm-hmm. So just wondered what people thought about how old she was and so forth.
Well, anyone else, feel free to chime in if you have a confident answer, but I'll say I recall Mad was 4 when she was being signed up for kindergarten, and Elizabeth was lying that she was really 5 years old. Right. And so I think that there is some confusion around age in the book because they're also lying about her age in the book. And so I think she starts as 4 when the show is picking up, and they're on air on the show. I think they said 2 years potentially. So she should be about 6 by the time the show is ending.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, and it pushed me back to my childhood, where I was in a rural area, and literally probably when I was 8 or 9, we would walk a mile across a busy highway to the where the bookmobile parked to get books and stuff. And this would be in the late 50s, early 1960s. So I think that's a very common, I mean, we had a lot more freedom
That's true.
just in playing. I mean, our moms would kind of push us out the door during the summer by 9 o'clock in the morning, and you just came back when it was dark. I mean, it was a whole different world then.
I just want to bring up the fact that her teachers at the school, I mean, that teacher was that just did not shine a very good light on teachers in accepting that child who was a challenge.
And who was accepting having a challenge in that they were higher in their education. I saw that with my granddaughter, and teacher, she was reading Nancy Drews when she was in first grade, and the teachers were just having quite a few issues with the fact that she was advancing herself along in that area, way ahead of what teachers expected kids to be at that time.
Yeah, I think a common theme in the book is how people aren't always happy to see genius. Calvin was greatly resented in the office. People were always looking for an opportunity to tear down Elizabeth and talk about her looks instead of her intelligence. Even Mad, when she went to school, the teacher, wasn't really appreciating her input, wasn't appreciating her intelligence. And I felt really hurt when I saw that the family tree was printed by a paper, and that assignment from her daughter was taken and publicized for, everyone across the nation to critique. What are your thoughts on how intelligence wasn't always necessarily celebrated in the novel, and how it maybe presented a challenge for all of these characters that we, kind of loved? A blessing and a curse, right?
Well, I think especially back in the 60s, I know myself, I come from that era. I was the first in my family to finish high school, go on to college. Certainly what they wanted from me in that day was to find someone, settle down and be a housewife. So there weren't all that many of us making that challenge at that time, even though post World War II, there were a lot more women moving into the workplace.
Yeah, there is a bit of a conversation on like family values in the novel. And I think a lot of it feels like chosen family who she's surrounding herself with. You hear about how her father is in jail and her mother is, avoiding taxes out of the country. And Calvin's family too was not present in his life. And here she is doing her best to raise a kid without much of a support system. And so all of these other characters that they sort of weave in become her family and her support. And some of them, I think all of them in their ways do appreciate the character's curiosity, but some have different ways of guiding her, or guiding Mad, I'm thinking specifically, especially when the family tree incident was happening and Harriet was trying to protect Mad by not having her talk to her mother about it, didn't want to bring up those emotions. But Elizabeth also didn't really know about the family tree project at all, which is kind of crazy considering how much that really ended up affecting the plot. And so I think that's how, Mad was taking a lot of responsibility upon herself. And like we were saying, she was given a lot of freedom. as she was going to the library and meeting with the Reverend. And I know I was shocked. We saw the Reverend, but Elizabeth's first time seeing him since the funeral was when she walked into her home and her daughter was alone in the house with this Reverend that she doesn't really know that well. And it's about this family tree project that she knows very little of. And so I think there were some times where after Elizabeth first had Mad and they were having their moments together, we lose a little bit of that relationship, I feel, as they start focusing on the show and other sort of plot lines, although I can tell they still have a very strong relationship. But I was curious if anyone else felt like there was maybe some disconnect between the daughter and mother, and if that was just natural to her growing up, or if you think maybe that there was just things we weren't seeing as much. And I would add with that, there's, 6:30 becomes almost like a father figure to Mad, I would argue, where he's one of the most stable presences. He's guarding her and protecting her. And even her confession to Reverend Wakely, Mad's confession was that the dog could speak like 980 words, I think. And the Reverend thought she was lying. Did anyone else think she was lying, or did you buy it through the dog's point of view that we hear in the book? Did you enjoy those little moments where you're seeing the world through the dog and seeing a bit more of their emotions? Do you think that added to the narrative, or were you kind of skeptical about the dog, or did it put you off a little bit?
I think dogs can be very sensitive. All of those words that the dogs might know, may simply be related to the sensitivity of the dog in relation to feeling emotions and feeling the environment and what's going on. But I thought the dog played a big part. I'm surprised it took us this long to start chit-chatting about the dog and its part in the story.
Yeah, the dog, I think after Calvin passed away, I think the dog really stepped in to start guiding the narrative more, which I found very interesting. I was admittedly a little bit put off at first, but I think after the first chapter or two, when I realized it would become more common, I was able to sort of set aside my reservations and appreciate this insight of a character that's around these people that are not openly discussing their emotions, but can sort of unpack it with us. As I felt like I cared about Elizabeth and I was able to see a bit more of what she was actually going through, but not talking about. And like you said, dogs can be very empathetic creatures and smarter than we give them credit for. The dog, 6:30, I think similar to all of our main characters, no one quite believed the dog was as smart as he was. And so I think the dog story mimicked Elizabeth's in some weird ways.
They underestimated what he did for the show too, just like they underestimated her. That's a good point you make.
Yeah. And even the producer of the show at one point, someone had asked, what does the dog do? And the producer said nothing, and then looked at the dog and exchanged this moment of heartbreak, where he knows the dog doesn't do nothing. And just like Elizabeth, this dog was trained to be a scientist. And now it's being told he doesn't really do anything important. And that just made me sad for the dog because even the dog was excited for time to come into the home lab kitchen and, press some of the buttons and show them what they can really do. And I think that relationship between Elizabeth and the dog was very precious.
I have to just interject a little bit about one thing about the dog. Probably my the most poignant scene in the book for me was that poor dog when he watched the original accident that he felt like he was responsible for, and watched Calvin, being taken away. Oh my God, that was so heartbreaking for that dog. And that just broke my heart, I gotta say.
And we also saw 3 storylines of the dog blaming themselves, of Elizabeth blaming themselves, and then the Reverend blaming himself when he found out Calvin moved there because of one letter that he wrote. And so I think that part of grief is explored a little bit. Where do you place that guilt? Well, we've already been talking for about an hour. Does anyone else have any thoughts they want to share on the dog, on the book, any more conversation that, we only just touched upon the dog in the last, 5-10 minutes here. I think there's a lot to unpack in this book. Does anyone else want to do that to anything maybe that we didn't touch upon enough? I'll just add, there's the sort of closing she has with the children set the table, your mother needs a moment to herself. So I just want to bring up that quote again as we're, taking this time out of our day to come sit together and talk about a book we've been reading. I know sitting down to read for me is really a moment where I just take some time for myself to slow down, not look at my phone and all these other things. Elizabeth, I think, has her erg and rowing. That is a moment for herself. But I think even science, and sometimes in a way, is her escaping to her passions, and reconnecting with her joys. We had talked about, committing yourself to a dream. And so does anyone have any just inspiration you want to share from the novels or hopes? I know we had talked about a sequel. If you have any dreams for maybe what Elizabeth's doing next, do you think she got finally maybe an article published in Science about her, or maybe she published her own paper finally on sciencey words I cannot pronounce properly and think of on call? Or maybe even just what happened to Mad. Does anyone want to share any thoughts about maybe next steps? I hope at least that Harriet and Walter, Harriet was finalizing her divorce in the last chapter or two. And so I hope the two of them are at least finding their own happiness.
Maybe Harriet will get a career going.
Yeah.
Although she's already a pretty good child caretaker, which is a very valuable thing.
True. I think that, as much as Elizabeth needed her, I think Harriet really needed them as well. And I think that, they were all very good for each other, and Harriet did a great job embracing their oddities, and really helping Mad, explore the world as she would. All right. Well, if no one has any last thoughts to share, then I just want to say thank you so much for joining me on this phone call. I was recording the meeting, and so I'll plan to share that on our YouTube page and send out a link afterwards. It might be unlisted, and so if you go to look and can't find the video, feel free to just reach out and contact me if you ever need anything. Again, I'm Jay Sowerman, the marketing manager at the station. And I'll put my email down in case you want to contact me for anything. I'm always available. And so this was our summer book club meeting. We'll meet again in 3 months and we'll update you on our book options in the coming weeks. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us on Zoom. I hope you liked it since we haven't had one of these in a while. And since we had a decent show, hopefully we could do some more of these if you guys enjoyed it. So that way, if you can't make it to Greensboro for a book club, you can still catch us online now and then.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Have a great weekend.